World War II was not only a clash of nations and ideologies, it was a turning point in the history of killing. Never before had warfare been shaped by such a rapid convergence of science, industry, and destruction. Weapons were no longer designed merely to defeat enemy soldiers on the battlefield. They were engineered to break entire armies, cities, and societies. The scale of industrialized death was unprecedented. Factories produced weapons in numbers unimaginable a generation earlier. Firepower increased not gradually, but exponentially. A single aircraft could destroy a neighborhood. A single submarine could sink a convoy. A single artillery barrage could erase a regiment in minutes. The battlefield expanded far beyond front lines, reaching factories, railways, ports, and civilian populations. What made these weapons truly deadly was not only their raw power, but their efficiency. New designs focused on range, speed, penetration, and reliability. Killing became faster, more distant, and increasingly impersonal. Soldiers often never saw the enemy they destroyed. Bombers struck from high altitude. Submarines attacked from beneath the sea. Rockets crossed borders without warning. Death arrived without confrontation. Technology erased traditional limits. Armor invited heavier guns. Heavy guns demanded faster aircraft. Faster aircraft required better detection and guidance. Each innovation triggered another, creating an arms race where survival depended on adaptation. Weapons evolved not in isolation, but as part of interconnected systems designed to overwhelm the enemy at every level. This transformation reshaped the psychology of war. Fear was no longer confined to soldiers in trenches. Entire populations lived under the threat of weapons they could not see or stop. Air raid sirens, blackouts, and evacuation plans became part of daily life. War became omnipresent, felt even in moments of silence. Yet behind every deadliest weapon stood human choice. Engineers, commanders, and political leaders decided how these tools would be used, where they would strike, and against whom. The deadliness of World War II weapons was not inevitable. It was the result of decisions made under pressure, ambition, and desperation. To understand the Second World War, one must understand its weapons, not as machines alone, but as instruments that changed how humanity defined power, violence, and survival itself. At the heart of World War II's unprecedented lethality stood a weapon that transformed battlefields into zones of mass death: the machine gun. Though invented decades earlier, it was during the Second World War that the machine gun reached its most refined, widespread, and devastating form. It became the backbone of modern infantry warfare and one of the primary reasons assaults could fail or succeed in minutes. Machine guns fundamentally changed the balance between offense and defense. A single well-positioned gun crew could halt an entire infantry advance. With sustained, high-rate fire, these weapons denied ground, shattered formations, and forced soldiers to seek cover instantly. Open terrain became lethal. Movement without coordination became suicidal. World War II saw machine guns integrated into every level of combat. Light machine guns moved with infantry squads, providing mobile, suppressive fire. Medium and heavy machine guns were mounted on tripods, vehicles, bunkers, and defensive emplacements, locking down roads, beaches, and choke points. On D-Day, machine gun nests overlooking the Normandy beaches inflicted devastating casualties within the first moments of landing, demonstrating their terrifying defensive power. Technological improvements made these weapons even more deadly. Air-cooled and water-cooled designs allowed prolonged firing. Improved ammunition feeds reduced jamming. Higher reliability meant guns could operate under extreme conditions, mud, sand, snow, and rain, where older weapons might fail. Once a machine gun opened fire, it rarely stopped until its position was neutralized. Psychologically, the machine gun reshaped how soldiers experienced combat. Its distinctive sound, sharp, relentless, mechanical, instilled immediate fear. Veterans often described machine gun fire as impersonal and unstoppable, a wall of metal rather than an individual enemy. Survival depended less on courage and more on tactics, coordination, and sheer luck. Machine guns also forced changes in doctrine. Armies learned that frontal assaults without artillery, support, armor, or air cover were catastrophic. Suppression, flanking maneuvers, and combined arms tactics became essential. In this sense, the machine gun did not just kill, it dictated how wars were fought. By the end of World War II, the machine gun had proven itself as one of the most lethal and influential weapons ever deployed. It embodied the industrial nature of the conflict, efficient, relentless, and devastating at scale. In many battles, it was not the bomb or the tank that decided the outcome, but the moment a machine gun began to fire. If the machine gun defined defensive power, the tank redefined offensive warfare. World War II transformed the tank from a supporting weapon into a decisive instrument capable of breaking fronts, encircling armies, and reshaping entire campaigns. Steel, mobility, and firepower combined into a single force that could dominate land warfare like nothing before it. Early in the war, tanks revealed their true potential during Germany's Blitzkrieg campaigns. Concentrated armored formations supported by infantry and aircraft punched through enemy lines at high speed. Tanks no longer advanced slowly alongside foot soldiers. They raced ahead, bypassing strong points, severing supply lines, and spreading confusion deep behind the front. Entire armies collapsed, not because they were destroyed, but because they were outmaneuvered. As the war progressed, tank design became an arms race of its own. Thicker armor demanded more powerful guns. More powerful guns required stronger engines and heavier chassis. Medium tanks evolved into heavily armored machines capable of engaging enemies at long range. On the Eastern Front, massive armored clashes saw hundreds, sometimes thousands, of tanks fighting simultaneously, turning open plains into graveyards of twisted steel. Tanks were deadly, not only because of their firepower, but because of their psychological impact. The sound of engines, the sight of armored columns advancing, and the inability of small arms to stop them created panic among unprepared defenders. Infantry without anti-tank weapons often faced an impossible choice: flee or be crushed. Yet tanks were not invincible. Mines, artillery, aircraft, and specialized anti-tank weapons inflicted devastating losses. Urban environments and rough terrain limited their effectiveness. Success depended on coordination. Tanks that advanced alone were vulnerable. Tanks that advanced as part of combined arms were unstoppable. By the end of World War II, tanks had become symbols of modern warfare. They represented speed, shock, and industrial power. Battles were no longer won by holding ground inch by inch, but by breaking through, exploiting gaps, and never allowing the enemy to recover. The tank did not simply support the battlefield. It reshaped it, rolling over the old rules of war and replacing them with a new reality of armored dominance. World War II marked the moment when air power became a primary instrument of destruction rather than a supporting force. Bombers transformed war from a struggle between armies into a conflict that reached deep into the heart of nations. For the first time in history, entire cities, factories, rail hubs, and civilian neighborhoods became deliberate targets of military strategy. Strategic bombing aimed to break an enemy's ability and will to fight. Heavy bombers flew thousands of miles to strike industrial centers, oil facilities, and transportation networks. In theory, destroying factories would cripple production. In practice, bombing also shattered civilian life. Firestorms, collapsing infrastructure, and mass displacement turned urban centers into front lines. Technology made this possible. Long-range aircraft carried massive bomb loads, guided by improved navigation and formation tactics. Defensive machine guns and fighter escorts attempted to protect bombers from interception, while radar and early warning systems sought to detect incoming raids. The skies above Europe and the Pacific became continuous battlefields. The human cost was immense. Bombing campaigns killed hundreds of thousands of civilians and left millions homeless. Sirens, blackouts, and shelters became part of daily existence. Cities like Hamburg, Dresden, Tokyo, and others were reduced to ruins in a matter of hours. War was no longer distant. It arrived from the sky without warning. For bomber crews, the experience was equally brutal. Missions faced intense anti-aircraft fire, enemy fighters, and extreme cold at high altitude. Casualty rates were staggering. Entire crews vanished when aircraft were hit. Survival often depended on luck as much as skill. Strategic bombing remains one of the most controversial aspects of World War II. Supporters argue it shortened the war by destroying industrial capacity and weakening morale. Critics question its effectiveness and moral cost. What is undeniable is its impact. Bombers changed warfare forever by making civilian populations inseparable from military targets. Once cities could be destroyed from the air, war would never again be confined to the battlefield. Among the deadliest weapons of World War II, few inspired as much fear as the submarine. Invisible, patient, and lethal, submarines turned the world's oceans into hunting grounds where death could arrive without warning. They did not seek decisive battles. They strangled nations slowly, by cutting lifelines of food, fuel, and raw materials. Nowhere was this more evident than in the Battle of the Atlantic. German U-boats targeted Allied merchant shipping, sinking cargo vessels faster than they could be replaced in the early years of the war. Each torpedoed ship meant not only lost supplies, but lost crews, often left to die in freezing waters. Entire convoys could be devastated by a handful of submarines operating in coordinated wolf packs. Submarines were deadly because they exploited invisibility. Operating beneath the surface, they could observe targets undetected, strike suddenly, and vanish again. Night attacks made them even more dangerous. On the surface, U-boats used darkness to blend with the sea, launching torpedoes before escorts even realized they were under attack. The psychological impact was severe. Merchant sailors knew that at any moment, without seeing an enemy, their ship could explode beneath them. Survival rates after sinking were often low. Fear traveled with every convoy, and morale became a strategic factor. As the war progressed, anti-submarine warfare improved. Radar, sonar, depth charges, and air patrols slowly turned the tide. But until those systems matured, submarines came dangerously close to cutting Britain off from the world. In the Pacific, submarines played a similar role, devastating Japanese shipping and accelerating economic collapse. Submarines did not conquer territory or hold ground. Their power lay in disruption. By denying the enemy movement and supply, they attacked the foundation of war itself. World War II proved that control of the seas was not won only by battleships and fleets, but by unseen predators operating in silence below the waves. If any weapon truly earned the title the God of War during World War II, it was artillery. Long before soldiers saw the enemy, and long after battles seemed decided, artillery delivered destruction with relentless efficiency. More soldiers were killed by artillery fire than by any other weapon in the war, making it one of the deadliest forces on every front. Artillery dominated the battlefield through range and volume. Heavy guns could strike targets miles away, unseen and unreachable by those they destroyed. Barrages softened enemy positions before attacks, shattered defenses, and turned landscapes into fields of craters. In major offensives, thousands of guns fired simultaneously, creating walls of fire that advanced step by step ahead of infantry and armor. Technological improvements increased artillery's lethality. More accurate targeting, better shells, and improved coordination allowed guns to hit with devastating precision. Forward observers, often operating under extreme danger, directed fire by radio, adjusting impacts in real time. Entire enemy units could be annihilated without ever engaging in direct combat. The psychological effect of artillery was overwhelming. Soldiers described the constant thunder, the shock waves, and the helplessness of waiting under bombardment. There was often no escape, only endurance. Even experienced veterans feared artillery more than direct firefights because survival depended almost entirely on chance. Artillery shaped strategy as much as tactics. Defensive lines were built around gun positions. Offensives stalled or succeeded based on ammunition supply. In sieges and urban battles, artillery reduced buildings to rubble, erasing cover and civilians alike from the equation of safety. By the end of World War II, artillery had proven that the most dangerous weapon was not always the one you could see. It was the one that reached you first, struck without warning, and left nothing standing where it landed. World War II introduced a new and terrifying concept to warfare: weapons that could strike without pilots, without warning, and without the possibility of interception. Rockets represented a leap beyond traditional artillery and bombing, ushering in an age where destruction could arrive silently from the edge of space. Germany led this transformation with the development of long-range rockets, most notably the V-1 and V-2 weapons. Unlike aircraft, these weapons could not be shot down reliably once launched. The V-1 flying bomb announced itself with a distinctive engine sound, terrorizing civilians who knew that silence meant imminent impact. The V-2 was even more frightening. It traveled faster than sound. There was no warning at all. Explosions came first. Understanding came later. Rockets changed the relationship between attacker and defender. Traditional air defenses became nearly useless. Cities were struck not because they were near front lines, but because they were within range. London, Antwerp, and other population centers lived under constant threat from weapons launched hundreds of kilometers away by crews they would never see. Although rockets caused fewer casualties than conventional bombing, their psychological impact was immense. They demonstrated that future wars would not require air superiority to devastate cities. Technology alone could deliver destruction. Fear became a strategic weapon. From a military perspective, rockets were inefficient and expensive, but revolutionary. Engineers learned how to guide, stabilize, and propel weapons at unprecedented speeds. These lessons would outlive the war itself. The same technology that carried explosives into cities would later carry satellites into orbit and missiles across continents. Rockets did not decide the outcome of World War II, but they changed the future of warfare forever. They marked the moment when humanity crossed a threshold, where weapons no longer needed pilots, and where distance no longer guaranteed safety. The sky itself had become a launch platform. Among the most feared weapons of World War II was one that operated not at distance, but face to face. Flamethrowers were designed for a specific purpose, to clear positions that conventional weapons could not reach. Bunkers, trenches, caves, and fortified buildings became death traps once fire entered the equation. Flamethrowers were especially prominent in the Pacific War. Japanese defensive doctrine relied heavily on deeply dug bunkers and cave systems, often invisible to artillery and resistant to small arms. Infantry assaults against these positions resulted in horrific casualties. Fire changed the balance instantly. A single flamethrower operator could force defenders out or kill them where they hid. The physical effect was devastating. Jets of burning fuel could engulf enclosed spaces in seconds, consuming oxygen and generating extreme heat. Survival inside a targeted position was unlikely. The weapon's purpose was not precision, but denial, making any shelter unusable. Psychologically, flamethrowers were weapons of terror. Their appearance alone often caused panic. Soldiers on both sides understood what fire meant. For attackers, using flamethrowers carried immense risk. Operators were prime targets, burdened by heavy equipment and highly visible fuel tanks. Many did not survive long in combat. Despite their effectiveness, flamethrowers were controversial, even during the war. Their use blurred the line between necessity and brutality. Yet commanders viewed them as essential tools for reducing casualties overall, shortening battles that would otherwise require costly frontal assaults. Flamethrowers symbolized the brutal intimacy of World War II combat. They were not weapons of strategy or distance, but of final confrontation. In a war defined by industrial killing, they reminded soldiers that some of the deadliest moments still came at arm's length. World War II turned the fighter aircraft into one of the most lethal and decisive weapons ever created. Speed, altitude, and firepower combined in machines that could dominate skies, protect armies, and destroy enemies in seconds. Control of the air became essential. Whoever owned the sky shaped everything below it. Fighter aircraft were no longer used only for reconnaissance or limited engagements. They hunted bombers, strafed ground forces, escorted fleets, and intercepted attacks before they reached their targets. Air superiority meant freedom of movement. Without it, armies advanced blindly, supply lines were exposed, and cities were vulnerable. Technological innovation drove fighter lethality rapidly. Aircraft became faster, more maneuverable, and more heavily armed. Cannons replaced rifle-caliber guns. Armor and self-sealing fuel tanks improved survivability. Radar guidance and radio coordination allowed fighters to be directed precisely to incoming threats. Dogfights evolved from individual duels into coordinated battles fought at extreme speeds. The human cost was high. Fighter pilots operated under constant stress, knowing that a single mistake meant death. Engagements lasted seconds. There was no cover, no retreat, only reaction and skill. Many pilots survived dozens of missions only to be lost in an instant. Survival rates were unforgiving. Fighters also terrorized those on the ground. Low-level strafing attacks shattered morale, destroyed vehicles, and disrupted troop movements. Soldiers learned to fear the sudden scream of engines overhead, knowing there was little they could do to defend themselves. By the war's end, fighter aircraft had become symbols of modern power. They proved that speed itself could be a weapon, and that wars would increasingly be decided in the air, long before armies met on the ground. World War II possessed the potential to become the most devastating chemical war in history. All major powers had stockpiled vast quantities of poison gas, far deadlier than those used in World War I. Nerve agents, blister agents, and choking gases were mass-produced, weaponized, and ready for deployment. And yet, in a war defined by extreme violence, chemical weapons remained largely unused on the battlefield. This restraint was not driven by morality, but by fear. Every major nation understood that chemical warfare would trigger immediate retaliation. Once unleashed, gas would not remain controlled. Winds could shift, civilians could be exposed, entire cities could be poisoned. The memory of World War I, where gas blinded, burned, and suffocated soldiers by the tens of thousands, still haunted military planners. Ironically, this mutual fear made chemical weapons some of the deadliest tools never fired. Germany developed nerve agents far more lethal than anything known at the time, capable of killing in minutes through mere contact or inhalation. The Allies, unaware of the full extent of German capabilities, prepared massive retaliation plans involving aerial gas bombardment. The result was a silent standoff, an invisible line no one dared cross. Gas masks, protective suits, and training became routine. Soldiers drilled for attacks that never came. Cities prepared for clouds that never arrived. The absence of chemical warfare was itself a constant psychological presence, proof of how close the world stood to total escalation. Chemical weapons demonstrated a grim truth. Some weapons are so destructive that their greatest power lies in deterrence rather than use. World War II proved that deadliness alone does not determine whether a weapon will shape the battlefield. Sometimes the fear of what could happen is enough to change the course of history. The war moved forward without gas, but the shadow of chemical warfare would linger long after the fighting ended. While bombs, tanks, and aircraft dominate popular memory, the majority of World War II's killing was carried out by far simpler tools. Rifles, pistols, and grenades, collectively known as small arms, were responsible for more casualties than any other category of weapon. They were the instruments of everyday combat, used in trenches, forests, ruins, and streets across every front of the war. The standard infantry rifle remained the backbone of armies worldwide. Reliable, durable, and deadly, rifles allowed soldiers to engage enemies at medium and long range with precision. Bolt-action designs emphasized accuracy and discipline, while semi-automatic rifles increased rate of fire and battlefield flexibility. In close combat, submachine guns delivered devastating firepower, transforming urban fighting into brutal, fast-paced encounters. Hand grenades added another layer of lethality. Thrown into rooms, trenches, and bunkers, they turned confined spaces into instant kill zones. Grenades were especially effective in clearing positions where visibility was limited and reaction time was minimal. Their use required courage and proximity, combat measured in meters rather than miles. Small arms shaped the soldier's experience of war more than any other weapon. They demanded direct confrontation. Victory depended on training, coordination, and nerve. Unlike artillery or bombing, there was no distance from the enemy. Killing was personal, immediate, and often chaotic. Technological refinement increased their effectiveness. Improved sights, ammunition, and manufacturing consistency made weapons more reliable under harsh conditions. Mass production ensured that millions of soldiers were armed quickly, turning entire populations into fighting forces. World War II proved that while grand strategies and powerful machines shape campaigns, wars are ultimately fought, and lives are most often taken by individuals holding small arms. These weapons lacked spectacle, but they defined the daily reality of combat and carried the heaviest human cost of the war. If small arms defined the soldier's immediate fight, artillery defined the battlefield itself. No weapon killed more soldiers in World War II than artillery. Shells fired from miles away shaped offensives, halted advances, and erased entire units without warning. Often unseen and unheard until impact, artillery became the war's most efficient instrument of mass death. Artillery dominated every front. Heavy guns softened enemy positions before assaults, while mobile artillery followed advancing troops, delivering continuous fire support. Barrages could last for hours or days, pulverizing terrain, destroying defenses, and breaking morale. Soldiers learned to fear the whistle of incoming shells more than direct enemy contact. Accuracy improved dramatically during the war. Better mapping, forward observers, and radio communication allowed guns to concentrate fire with devastating precision. Entire grid squares could be annihilated in minutes. Defensive artillery created killing zones where advances became nearly impossible without massive losses. Psychological effects were as lethal as physical destruction. Constant shelling exhausted troops, shattered nerves, and erased any sense of safety. Trenches and foxholes offered limited protection against direct hits. Survivors often emerged disoriented, traumatized, and incapable of immediate combat. Industrial capacity determined artillery's power. Nations that could manufacture guns, shells, and replacement barrels at scale held a decisive advantage. The Allies, particularly the Soviet Union and the United States, turned artillery into a relentless force that overwhelmed Axis defenses through sheer volume. Artillery rarely appears in dramatic wartime imagery, yet it defined modern industrial warfare. It did not seek individual targets. It destroyed everything within reach. In World War II, artillery was not just a supporting weapon. It was the backbone of battlefield destruction. Tanks were not new in World War II, but the war transformed them into the dominant force of ground combat. What began as slow, unreliable machines in earlier conflicts evolved into fast, heavily armed weapons capable of breaking defenses, exploiting breakthroughs, and deciding campaigns. Steel replaced trenches as the defining feature of land warfare. Early in the war, German armored forces demonstrated how devastating tanks could be when used correctly. Blitzkrieg combined speed, firepower, and coordination, allowing armored units to punch through enemy lines and collapse entire fronts in days. Tanks were no longer support weapons. They were the spearhead. As the war progressed, tank design became a race of armor versus firepower. Thicker armor demanded larger guns. Larger guns required stronger engines. Nations produced increasingly lethal machines, from the Soviet T-34, simple, durable, and mass-produced, to the German Tiger, whose firepower and armor inspired fear wherever it appeared. Tanks reshaped tactics on every front. Infantry learned to fight alongside armor or be destroyed by it. Anti-tank weapons became essential. Entire battles revolved around armored engagements, where victory depended on positioning, logistics, and mechanical reliability as much as bravery. Yet tanks were not invincible. Mechanical breakdowns, fuel shortages, mines, and air attacks constantly threatened them. A tank, without support, was vulnerable. The war proved that armored dominance required coordination with infantry, artillery, and air power. World War II cemented the tank as a symbol of modern warfare. It represented industrial strength, technological innovation, and strategic thinking. From the ruins of Europe to the deserts of North Africa, tanks turned mobility into destruction and permanently changed how wars were fought on land. World War II marked the first time in history when entire cities became deliberate military targets. Strategic bombers turned the air war into a campaign of mass destruction, capable of reaching deep behind enemy lines and reshaping the course of the conflict without direct contact with ground forces. Heavy bombers like the American B-17 Flying Fortress, B-29 Super Fortress, and the British Lancaster carried unprecedented payloads. Factories, rail hubs, oil refineries, and ports were no longer safe behind front lines. Industrial capacity itself became a battlefield. Destroying an enemy's ability to produce weapons was as important as defeating armies in the field. Bombing campaigns escalated rapidly. Daylight precision bombing aimed at crippling industry, while nighttime area bombing sought to break morale and overwhelm defenses. Cities such as Hamburg, Dresden, Tokyo, and many others were reduced to ruins. Firestorms consumed entire districts, killing tens of thousands in a single night. Defenses responded with fighters, radar, and anti-aircraft guns, turning the skies into deadly corridors. Bomber crews faced extreme danger. Casualty rates were among the highest of any branch of service. Survival depended on altitude, formation flying, and defensive firepower. Despite the human cost, strategic bombing altered the balance of war. It forced nations to divert enormous resources to air defense. Production slowed, transportation collapsed. Civilian populations became directly tied to military outcomes in ways never seen before. By 1945, bombers had demonstrated their ultimate power. The atomic bomb, delivered by a single aircraft, revealed that strategic air power could end wars outright. The bomber was no longer just a weapon. It was a force capable of reshaping history. World War II proved that control of the sky meant control of the enemy's future. No weapon of World War II matched the destructive power or the historical impact of the atomic bomb. Developed in absolute secrecy under the Manhattan Project, it represented a technological leap so vast that it instantly redefined warfare, politics, and humanity's relationship with destruction. On August 6th and August 9th, 1945, atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In seconds, entire cities were obliterated. A single explosion unleashed energy equivalent to tens of thousands of tons of TNT. Buildings vanished. Temperatures reached levels hotter than the surface of the sun. Tens of thousands died instantly, with many more succumbing later to radiation sickness and injuries. Unlike conventional weapons, the atomic bomb did not rely on prolonged campaigns or mass deployment. One aircraft, one bomb, one moment. The scale of destruction made traditional defenses meaningless. There was no warning, no countermeasure, no battlefield in the conventional sense. The weapon bypassed armies entirely and struck at the heart of society. The psychological effect was just as powerful as the physical destruction. Japan's leadership faced a reality no nation had encountered before: the possibility of total annihilation without invasion. Within days, Japan surrendered, bringing World War II to an abrupt end. Yet the atomic bomb's legacy extended far beyond 1945. It introduced a new era in which human survival itself could be threatened by technology. Power was no longer measured only in divisions, fleets, or factories, but in the ability to destroy the world. World War II's deadliest weapon was also its final one. The atomic bomb did not just end a war. It changed the meaning of war forever.